I'm Mark Diminution. I'm chief of the Rare Book Division, and we're very happy to have here today the young Russell Maret. An appellation that he earned many, many years ago, back in the Eisenhower administration when Russell, but I have known Russell for a very long time. And when he came in, he was a young printer and had been just starting up. I think his oldest production now, which is 1996, I think, right?
94.
94. Yeah. I think I knew. And has been producing consistently since then. What has happened with Russell is that he's emerged from being a kind of spunky, at the edge, always pushing himself sort of printer to emerge to become one of the greatest, certainly one of the most innovative, and what was the third one you wanted me to say? Genre breaking. You knew you were going to pay for that, didn't you? Genre breaking printers of his generation. I actually sincerely mean that, and anyone who knows his work, especially the flow of his work over time, would agree. He's a great friend to this institution. We are the home of much of his archival material, which means people in Washington have the opportunity not only to look at his books, but also understand the process of this innovative, grand, genre-breaking printer, and understand the meaning behind many of his books. Today, for a change, he's going back in time, and if there's anything that Russell can do, he can tell a story. And there are many, many a story from Russell's publications, because one of the things he does, typically in a publication, is try something that's utterly impossible. And those of us who've been on the phone with him when he's printing, where you say, you're running it through 17 times? All blue? I don't understand. You'll get a notion of that from Russell's talk. So we're really thrilled to have my good friend Russell here today. So please welcome him.
Thank you. Yeah, I had this nice smooth entrance planned, but you messed it up. Anyway, DC has a real warm place in my heart because this is going to sound weird, but the two largest collections of my work are here. That's not why it has the warm spot. It's because those collections were built by two people, Al Mears and Mark Diminution, who have become very dear and close friends of mine. And the reason that we're here today is because Al Mears, who is the only person who has a complete collection of my published work, has decided to sell his copy of the first book I published, Meditation on Saviors, to the library, which is the only book of mine they do not have. And for any collector in the room, you'll understand how momentous a gesture that is for a collector to relinquish their top position, and so I just want to thank Al. I'm sure it's bittersweet. It is for both of us. But in thinking about, when I say he's the only person who has a complete collection, what I mean by that is I've never owned a copy of Meditation on Saviors. And the process of making it was so excruciating, both psychologically and technically, that I've tried ever since to forget it. But in thinking about this gesture of the book moving here, I realized that the things that made it so difficult, technically at least, rather than me having learned from them and stopped using that as a working method, that the process by which I came to the design and making of Meditation on Saviors is the process that I employ in almost all the work I've made since, which is why I get those weird phone calls. You're doing what? So I decided that it would be fun to look back at some projects through that lens of the sort of completely impractical decision that ends up bringing me into new ground or whatever in my work. And so the story starts when I looked like this. When I was 18 years old, I got on a train in New York for San Francisco to study poetry at the New College of California, now defunct. And shortly after arriving, I walked into a print shop that was in the basement and had my first profound experience of love at first sight. And it was literally the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and I've done it for the 30 years since then. And shortly after that experience, I met Peter Koch, who a great printer in the Bay Area who was teaching at New College for that 1 year. And I started apprenticing in his studio. And at the time, he also got me a gig living and working at the press in Tuscany Alley, which was a storied California private press. And between the two of those, I really had this feeling that I was being sort of inculcated into the tradition of the California private press. And for that movement, there's no greater bard than Robinson Jeffers. He is seen here in the iconic photograph by Edward Weston, with open collar in front of rock. He's a man. He's a man. And for those of you who don't know Robinson Jeffers, he and his wife Una moved to Carmel when it was a very different place. Clint Eastwood didn't live there. And he built them a house out of granite and cypress from the Carmel headlands called Tor House and Hawk Tower. And this all became part of his sort of myth as this rugged, misanthropic poet who sat in his tower and looked at the sea with his back to humanity. And he wrote a lot of things. My favorite line from Hurt Hawks is, "I'd sooner accept the penalties, kill a man than a hawk." He wrote things like that. And the editions of his work that are published by private press printers tend to sort of emphasize that aspect of him, that sort of manly quality. This is Peter Koch's Point Lobos. The slide doesn't give a sense of its scale, but two people could eat dinner comfortably off of this book. It's huge and massive, and it clearly references the most famous edition of Robinson Jeffers' poetry, William Everson's Granite and Cypress, which is a remarkable typographic work that's housed in, I think now, looking back on it, as a kind of gimmicky cypress and granite box. The book itself, the printed book, is really remarkable. But this was this is how the private press movement had traditionally interpreted Robinson Jeffers' work. And however much I might have thought of myself, like to think of myself as being like Robinson Jeffers, I'm really not. And I just chose this picture for two reasons. One, it's me with my collar open in front of rock. The other is that you can't see it very well, but I'm wearing a striped short sleeve shirt, which is the shirt that I wore the first time I came to meet Marked Immunation here.
Probably your only shirt.
Probably my only shirt, yeah. I spent it all on paper. But anyway, so I finished my apprenticeship or ended my apprenticeship in California and went on to work at Firefly Press in Boston for a bit, and then found my way back to New York and to start a press. And I knew I wanted to make books, but it was really hard figuring out what book to make. And in the process, I sort of met this illustrator, Murray Tinkelman, who somehow convinced me to do a book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. And at some point, I became keenly aware that I didn't want my first book to be about a subject for which I didn't care, which is baseball. And so I started talking with this artist, Paul Maloney, in California, and we came up with the idea of maybe doing a Jeffers book with some poems and his illustrations. And at the time, I thought it would be very much in that vein of the California, the big, chunky book. But in the meantime, I wrote a poem for a girlfriend of mine at the time and decided to print it as a book. And she had lived in Japan. And So I came up with this idea of making a book that would be like a Japanese screen, where I'd make these little wood screens, stretch the printed pages over the front, and then put a decorative paper on the back, and it would collapse and open up and everything. So I set to work, I printed the poem, I built my little balsa wood screens and stretched the thing, and then put the decorative paper on the back. And the minute I finished putting the decorative paper on the back, I realized that it couldn't close. Emblematic of our relationship, I think. Now, one might think that having made this structure that didn't work, that you wouldn't choose it as the structure for your first book to make an edition of, but you would be wrong. And so, anyway, I came up with this idea that I wanted to make a book of Robinson, because although he has all of this really gritty writing, like, boulders blunted like bear's teeth, this thick masculine writing, he also is extremely effusive about sunsets and rainbows, and his poetry is populated by sort of hard frontier characters, but it's full of remarkably sensitive observations of nature and people and motives and love. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to make a book that was the exact opposite of what one expected of Robinson Jeffers. And here it is. So instead of a heavy book, this can't weigh 8 ounces. I mean, it's just incredibly light. And so there I was, okay, I'm going to make this book. And so I get my little font of type, and I buy the Kitakata paper, and I print it. And all of a sudden, I'm completely overcome by crippling self-doubt. And the sheets of paper sit in my living room for months, like a, albatross. Like every time I looked at them, they're like, you failed, you're not going to do it, you're not going to do it. Anyway, I finally got the will to start making this, and I go down to the Center for Book Arts and cut my little pieces of balsa wood, and for the first 4 or 5 copies, either the second or third of the 6th panels was either the wrong page, or upside down, or completely misaligned. I ruined all. It was as if my doubt just chose to sabotage me. It was miserable. I had this little coffee table in front of my sofa where I did all the cutting and everything, and my girlfriend's parents were like, who the hell is this guy? But anyway, I finally finished one, and I had no idea what to do with it, so I called the book dealer Burton Weiss in California, who's the only book dealer I knew, and I said, look, I made this book. Let me send one to you, see what you can do, and I need help deciding what to price it, and I thought maybe $1,500 or something, and I send it out to him, and he calls me up, and he's like, $475. I'm like, oh, well, okay, and he said, and then he goes, and I want the whole edition. And I never forget this feeling of hanging up the phone and just thinking, I'm going to be rich. And, all I've heard about is Peter Koch complaining about how hard it is to sell books. It's easy. And, well, the easy part of it meant that over 9 months, I managed to make 14 copies that I got, 13 of them I got $285 for. The paper on the back cost $30 per copy. There were 2 times when I went into New York City, bought the paper, and left it on the train after I got off. Anyway. So, but what's amazing is that this horrible process resulted in 2 great things. I published a book which got rid of an enormous amount of fear of putting myself out there. And shortly after selling a couple of copies to Burton Weiss, I got a letter from a man named Al Mears telling me how wonderful he thought the book was. And it was just this transformative moment for me. But so it's also this idea that printing is such a practical art, but here was an example of making a decision about my work that was so impractical, but it led to this sort of wonderful thing ultimately. And I've just realized that that's sort of what I've continued to do. And so I'm just going to talk about, I've got most of the books out that I'm going to talk about. A couple of years after making Meditation on Saviors, I was looking at this woodcut by Francesco Clemente, and I thought, God, it looks like a watercolor. And at the time I was living with a couple of guys, one of whom was a theater designer, and he had a book on the Commedia dell'arte, about which I knew nothing, but I started reading about it, and I was fascinated by this idea that the characters were sort of lived beyond the people who actually played them. They were stock characters who were recognizable by their sort of stock outfits and the colors that they wore. And I thought, wow, this would be really fun to get a bunch of magnesium cuts of appropriated imagery of these characters from the Commedia dell'arte, assign each a color, ink them in watercolor paint, and print them with paper that had standing water on them and make it bleed and be all this romantic sort of Commedia dell'arte bleedy stuff. And so I ran out and I got one magnesium dye and a tube of paint, and I went to the Center for Book Arts and I rolled one up and took a sheet of paper out of a bath of water and carried it over to a steel press with water just going everywhere. And ran it through, and it worked, and it was fantastic. And so I bought all this paper, I bought all these cuts, bought my watercolor paint, and it turned out that one print worked, but it was a very, very hot summer. And the Center for Book Arts at the time was 5,000 square feet with one little air conditioner window unit. And it was so hot that I would roll the watercolor onto the plate, and by the time I got the paper out of the bath and over, it would have just dried enough, and the water was so wet that I'd print it, and rather than the paint going onto the paper would stay on the plate. And so I realized that what I had to do was print it in the middle of the night, when it would be as cool as possible. And so I would get to the center at 1 a.m, and I would get and some of these, because it was watercolor, you had to print all the colors in the same go. And some of the pages, I think the most is 4 colors or 5 colors or 3 or something. And so imagine you've got your table, you roll out the 3 colors, you run over to the press and you're sort of holding the brayers and going like that, and then you get the paper, run it through, go like that, and then you have to clean everything because the paint is dried on your brayers, on the glass, on the plates, and everything. And it was just, one of those moments where I did create this book that was, it's got colors in it in a way that I've never had in a book before. The prints are, looking back at them, they're maybe not great. But but it was again this moment of just like, oh, well, it works once, it's probably going to work every time. Or it doesn't work, maybe it'll work every time. And a few months after that, I was looking at this drawing by Rudolf Koch and Fritz Kradel when I was suddenly possessed of the idea for a typeface for the Book of Job. I had never designed any kind of letter form. I can't really draw, and I'm not a calligrapher, but I just was absolutely convinced. And I spent the night awake in bed, and the next morning got out of bed and considered myself a type designer. And I really thought at the time, this was December 1st, 1996, I really thought at the time that in 1997 I would have a metal type of my Job typeface and I would print this book to worldwide acclaim. But since I didn't know how to design type, I figured I have to start by figuring out how to draw letter forms. And since I can't draw freehand, but I understand geometry, I thought, well, there's this tradition of geometric letter forms, and so I started drawing and painting geometric letters. And then I thought, well, there's no way I can afford to make a typeface, so how am I going to raise the money for it? And I know, I'll raise the money by making manuscripts of geometric alphabets, because there's a huge market for that. And I'll make tons of money, and I'll make my typeface, I don't think I need to tell you how that turned out. But so I started doing these manuscripts, editioned manuscripts, where I would paint and draw every letter of the alphabet in every copy. And although it never led to making, I didn't actually make a typeface until 2008, so 12 years later. But what it initiated was this, it was a completely crackpot moment. I think I had pneumonia at the time, actually. And what it ended up leading to was this extended study of letters as form. And which seems simple, but it's actually become, Mark is holding up the A from Eclectic Geometric or Lunch with Nicolette. This is the D and F and the P and X. This is the last and by far the most complex geometric alphabet that I've done. The Library of Congress also owns 2 unique alphabets of this kind. And, but so this completely crackpot idea ended up becoming, leading to a study and work that is the absolute foundation of my entire career since then. Every book of mine deals with letter forms in one way or another, and it's gotten to the point where I can't print my own words in another person's typeface without feeling like I'm lying. So that's a chapter. And the other thing it did was it completely tanked my printing career. From the time I started, from 1998 until 2007, I didn't publish any printed books, except for a couple of pamphlets. And then just to bring us into the contemporary era, in 2011, I designed my first typeface in 2008. By 2011, I had designed quite a few typefaces, and I had made a lot of books about discrete letter forms, alphabet books, and decided that what I wanted to do was to make a specimen of my typefaces. And while I was at the Codex Book Fair, I was talking to the representative of the Velké Loziny paper mill in the Czech Republic, and he told me that for under $3 a sheet, I could get a sheet of handmade paper this big with 2 custom watermarks in it. And I just thought, this is going to be great. Give me a couple of sheets that I can, test, and then, because I needed 3,000 sheets for the book. So I run home and I have these sheets of paper, and I do some tests, and I notice, the type looks a little blacker than usual, but I probably just over-inked it. Yeah, I'll take the 3,000 sheets. And there they are. The 3,000 sheets of paper coated in such a thick coat of gelatin sizing that the reason the letter forms look thick is because it was basically plastic. And when I printed the ink on them, instead of the ink being absorbed into the paper, it just went. And well, that's easy. Dampen the paper. Everybody in California has always told me, you draw 1 sheet through a bath of water, put 5 dry on, 1 sheet through a bath of water, 5 dry on, leave it wrapped up with a little weight on it. The next day it's beautiful. This is what it looked like the next day, corrugated tin. And so, but the problem was, in order to get the print quality I wanted, I needed to dampen it, which helps get some of the gelatin sizing off of it. But even if I found a way to dampen it and get it smooth, there was another problem, that the paper stretched 3/8 of an inch across its width when it was damp, which is enormous. And just to give you an idea of what kind of printing I was planning on doing, the tolerance of printing in Specimens of Diverse Characters, which is the book, is 1/288 of an inch. The registration, that's the registration, a 1/4 point. So the gray lines in which those 2 greens are printed is 1/288 of an inch thick. And just to show you what the difference is, this is 3/8 of an inch, and that's 288. So basically, if the paper is damp, the minute you take it out of the humidor, it starts shrinking in all kinds of crazy ways. And there, basically, unless I was printing wood type posters, there was no way I could use this. That was an unfair job. One color big prints. There was no way I could use this paper. So what I realized is I would have to dampen it and dry it before printing it, and which led to a bunch of experiments of how to dampen it and dry it so it dried smooth. We came up with loft drying, just hanging it with clips. The problem is 3,000 sheets of paper in a 270 square foot studio with 2 printing presses, 2 people, 2 tables, a plate maker, a guillotine cutter. So what we had to do was build lightweight drying racks that could be lifted with paper drying on it and put on tables. And so twine and basswood, this is Nancy stringing them up. And Nancy Lober and a variety of other assistants, mostly Sarah McDermott, spent over 500 hours that summer dampening and drying paper just so I could print on it, which was distressing. This is my studio. So, so I'm printing here. This is my press. I'm standing there. There's paper drying. There's paper drying there. It was crazy. It was just crazy. But the book that resulted, which is right there on the table, it is the most tactilely sensual book I've ever made. That paper after the, oh, I forgot to mention that at a certain point in the process, I realized that if I dampened and dried each sheet twice, it felt really good. So that's what we did. And so it was this crazy summer. It was not very enjoyable for Annie, I don't think. But
So if they hadn't sized the paper, would it have saved you some work?
Yes, but it could have caused other problems. But we can deal with that afterward. But the other thing, so it was completely worth it, is what I'm saying, for the book that ended up. I love this book, and it's the only book I've ever made that feels like that, which is great. And then the other thing that I did for this book was I finally made a metal type. 14 years after 2007, when I was supposed to have my metal Job typeface, for this book we ended up making 2 metal typefaces. And that's now a whole other thing for me. But so I'm just going to do 2 more short little things to show that this is still going on. For my book, Ornamental Digressions, I designed this 14-piece ornament set that I had cast in metal, and I wanted to do a specimen book of it that was going to involve a lot of color printing and a lot of registration and all of this stuff. And again, each design was inspired by a text, a historical text. And so one of the texts is by D.R. Hay, who was Queen Victoria's interior decorator. And he wrote a book called The Laws of Harmonious Coloring, which is such a Victorian title. And in it is this wonderful illustration, which I wanted to try to recreate in the book. And now when I'm doing complex color printing, I always proof all the way through to make sure all the colors work, everything works together. But with this print, I realized it was going to be 16 colors, and I just couldn't bear. I knew it was going to work. It was definitely going to work. And so I just didn't proof it, and I just printed the thing, and ended up with this. And immediately said, well, I can't, this is so ugly. It's an upside-down shield with like a radioactive sign in the middle. And the reason is because this whole design is predicated on 60-degree angles, and my ornaments work on 45-degree angles, and so it just doesn't work. The text is, no perfectly harmonious arrangement of colors can be made unless all the 3 primary colors be present, which I actually agree with. Cézanne was the great proof of this. Every color of his had all 3 colors in it. So anyway, so I didn't like this, and so I decided, okay, I'll design a different print that's only 9 press runs. And whereas this one had the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, this one just had primary and secondary. And although it's a bit rainbowy, you love having a spectrum in a color book. And while I'm printing books like this, I keep all the prints out on a table to just sort of get a sense of what everything is like. And one day, Nancy Lober was in the studio, and she came over, and she had her cup of coffee, and she's just sort of looking, and she puts her finger right here and just goes, "Doesn't harmonious have 2 O's?" And so I had printed a 16 press run and a 9 press run print with with 10 words, one of which was misspelled, and which ended up in me making this final 4 press run print, which is by far the best image. It only uses the 3 primary colors. You clearly see, when you look at it closely at least, how they modify each other. And all of the other ones had all this extraneous stuff that wasn't necessary. It just took 3 weeks of printing and a case of raging plantar fasciitis to figure it out. It was like, okay, the last one is the book I'm currently working on. Just a little thing. I don't have anything of that because it's at the binders now. But for this book, Character Traits, that I just finished printing, the book is about digital letter forms, and it explores the idea that digital letter forms are not typographic. They have nothing technologically in common with typographic letter forms, meaning metal type. And so I wanted to make a book where I designed lettering free from the presumptions of what typographic technology would make you make letters for. And because of that, I decided, I shouldn't print the letter forms on a typographic press. I should print them as etchings. And I've only printed 2 etchings before, but I'm sure I can do it. And what's even better is that by taking the plates and inking the intaglio lines and wiping the surface, I can then roll a second color onto the relief surface and get these 2 colors printed super vibrantly at the same time. And it'll be really cool. And it is cool until I tried printing it and realized that what that meant, it had never occurred to me that I would then have to clean, between every print, totally clean with solvent the intaglio lines and the surface and let it dry, or else the colors would contaminate each other and you'd only get one good print. And so this is the inking the intaglio, wiping the intaglio, rolling up, dousing solvent, scrubbing with a brush, and waiting for the plate to dry, which meant that at their worst, these prints could take 30 minutes each to make. And to give you an idea, for the whole edition, there were 2,375 etchings to be printed, which I'm now really good at printing. And so the solution was that the deluxe copies of the book have more 2-color prints in them than the standard copies of the book. So it allowed me to do what I wanted to do, but in a more limited way. And the standard copies still have some 2-color prints. But all of these examples are things that if Annie and I have this joke where she, asks me how it went in the studio today, and I'll say, well, I learned a lot. And that's when I'm in a good mood. So at the time, these feel kind of like torture, each one of these things. But without them, I would just be doing the same thing over and over again, which I have no tolerance to do. And so it's actually, even though every time it happens, I say next time it's going to be better, it's actually, the only thing that has to get better is my sort of living with the fact that things are going to go horribly wrong. And so to end, I love this because I'm going to quote from a publication that, according to its publication date, doesn't yet exist. The January 21st edition of the New Yorker. There was just this perfect quote to end from an article called Choose Wisely by Joshua Rothman, talking about the philosopher Agnes Callard. He says, "When we're aspiring, inarticulateness isn't a sign of unreasonableness or incapacity. In fact, the opposite may be true. Quote, everyone goes to college to become educated, Callard observes. But until I am educated, I do not really know what an education is or why it is important. If we couldn't aspire to changes that we struggle to describe, we'd be trapped within the ideas that we already have. Our inability to explain our reasons is a measure of how far we wish to travel. It's only after an aspirant has reached her destination, Callard writes, that, quote, she will say, this is why." Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions if people would like to.
What's next?
It's a big secret. No, I'm working on I have a lot of ideas, but I'm working on I'm editing a book of writing by Sandra Kirschenbaum, who is the editor of Fine Print magazine, that's going to be published by the Book Club of California this fall. I'm putting together a group of essays of mine into a book for publication by someone else, but that won't be ready probably to submit until the end of the year. And a couple other things. I want to. I'm really enjoying this experimenting with the differences between typographic and non-typographic letters, but I want to. One of the things that character traits taught me was that I draw these kind of crazy letter forms that that verge on abstraction, and then I print them individually. But then when I print text, I design pretty traditional looking typefaces, and I've always wanted those qualities to merge in some way. But what character traits taught me was that in order to do that, the content of my books needs to change. My text that I typically set in my traditional typefaces is usually notes or an addendum to some other work. And so I'm trying to figure out what that means, that somehow I need to start working with texts that allow me to experiment more visually with words rather than having them separate. So I've got a couple ideas of texts that I would like to explore that with, but I've got a lot to do in the meantime. Yeah?
In Specimens of Diverse Characters, could you speak a little bit about your mark making and plate making to kind of achieve some of the
Oh, yeah. So in the book Specimens of Diverse Characters, except for those two typefaces and some metal ornaments, everything is printed from photopolymer plates, which is primarily what I print from because I design my typefaces and letter forms on the computer, and I output a film negative, a laser film negative, and then expose it to a photopolymer plate that makes a raised printing surface. And in that book, there are a number of prints. When you think of a letterpress, you typically think of line and void. It's either solid printing or there's no printing. And but in this book, there's a lot of overprinting of subtle gradations of color and tone that were made by me just doing pencil drawings on tracing paper and scanning them and outputting them as half-tone film. And then, so I think those are the marks you're talking about. Yeah, so some of them are quite precise, but some of them are really just me making a field of graphite and then scanning it and using it as texture. But it's really wonderful because when you print one halftone plate, it looks dotty. It looks like it's a bunch of dots. When you print a second different one on top of it, it starts to look more like continuous tone. And so all of the sort of gradations of color that you see in that book are achieved by printing at least 2 and often 4 to 6 plates of halftones on top of each other. And so there's still a little bit of dottiness, but from this distance, it's convincing. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
Yeah, so continuing on with your use of computer
Uh-huh.
for design,
Right.
have you gotten into working with 3D at all on the computer? 3D capabilities, not to create something in 3D,
right.
but actually to manipulate forms in 3D on the screen.
No, not because I'm opposed to it. I'm one of those people who works a lot on the computer and doesn't like it. So I haven't been very adventurous in learning what the computer can do beyond drawing outlines, which is what I like to do on the computer. The outline gives me the form. And I haven't, even in my book Character Traits, where I'm experimenting with digital letter forms, most millennials would think that what I came up with was quite conservative, I think. They still look pretty much like letter forms, and so I haven't really gone deeply into what something that's just going to exist in digital space can be. But I like seeing it. It's just that I really, drawing letters on the computer, even though I do it all the time, is just excruciating. It's so, just dot, pull it a little, and it's just horrible. And so by the time I'm done with a day, all I want to do is like feel some oil on my hands, or something, and go to my print shop. So it's kind of nice that I get to split that, but yeah, no. Yeah?
We have the good fortune of sitting near eclectic geometric, and there's power emanating off these things. Can you talk about the black hole? Can you talk about the technique and how?
Yeah. Each one of those, the drawings are in pencil, liquid watercolor. Well, this one is just India ink, and then painted in black gouache. And that's what the black is, which is that wonderful non-reflective, and even on the sort of softer white paper of eclectic geometric, it's still, and I love that quality of the black. So the way it's done is every line is either pencil, the blue is liquid watercolor, and then the black lines and the outline of the letters are India ink. And then basically I then just painted in the lines with black gouache.
Edition of how many?
10. Started in 2001 and finished. I painted the last one in 2008, I think. And actually Nancy Lober painted about half of them. I did all the drawing, but she that was the first thing she worked for me on, was painting some of those.
They're elegant and powerful.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
Have you Are you familiar with Vanta Black, which is,
Oh, it's
it's like 99.9?
oh, yeah. That, what's his name owns? Yeah, Anish Kapoor owns. Yeah, I've still never seen it. But the,
It'd be interesting to have a print using that.
Well,
It takes a special lab to do it.
well, yeah, and he owns the color, period. There's no Russell getting to use Vanta Black.
I think a
So,
lot of
but
artists are-
he's
You
yeah.
don't need it. You don't need
Well,
it.
thank you. But I love Anish Kapoor's work, and I have felt that in recent years it's gotten a little too glossy, and so it'll be really fun to see what he does with something you can't see. Actually, I mean that's what's so amazing about it. It's just an absence of light, which is incredible. But yeah, it's for him to play with and me to admire.
I think we'll stop there. Before we thank Russell, if the people sitting on benches in front of the table can get up and push the benches in, people can come and look at books. We'll be happy to show you whatever you'd like to see. Keep in mind that some of these books don't belong to us, so we're asking you to be extra mindful today. But we're happy
Of not to
show you.
touch them.
Yeah, to not touch them. But we'll be happy to show you whatever we can. And let's thank Russell for a great talk.
Thank you.